My name's Karl and I'm a primitive technologist. I demonstrate and teach how prehistoric people would have made tools from flint, bone, antler, so it kind of incorporates bone making, all the primitive skills really.
Oh, fantastic. So how far are we going back?
We're going right the way back to the early Stone Age, so the first African stone tools, right the way through to the Bronze and Iron Age, where they were still making stone tools. It's just the function changed, and during the Iron Age they started to use the flint to produce a spark rather than just making cutting tools.
Oh, fantastic. You have a sort of a display on there, and could you walk me through the display, please?
Certainly, yeah. We've got tools like these. This is the hand axe, so that's the tool that would have been made in Britain 500,000 years ago, but of course as we trace our origins right the way back to Africa, we're dating that right the way back to 1.5 to almost 2 million years. But in Britain 500,000 years ago, this is a tool that would have been used to butcher the woolly mammoth. So a tool that was just purely handheld in the fingers, and with an upwards and downwards cutting motion you would chop through the meat very, very quickly. It's a very efficient serrated cutting tool.
Mm-hmm. Is that something that you've recreated, or is
these are all replicas that either myself or my apprentice have made. And it's a nice piece of flint.
What's the technique called to do that?
It's called flint knapping, which is really just the old English term for this technology. Flint obviously being the material, to knap is just the old English word meaning to break something with sharp edges.
Oh, right, okay. So let's have a look at other pieces. So you have the axe.
That's the hand axe. Then we've got the actual axe head. So that's the kind of tool that would have been made 5,000 years ago, that would have been hafted into a fairly robust hafting or handle, and that's a tool that would have been used to cut down trees in the Neolithic period. So we're talking about deforestation for the first farming there.
Okay, that's fantastic. What about scraping tools?
Scraping tools, this is the kind of thing that they would have been using to scrape. Got a fairly early example here, and you can see it's been worked from one direction. So with a hammerstone it's only been struck in one direction, so we end up with this nice flat side and a retouched edge on the other side, which is perfect for scraping skins. So that's the kind of tool that would have been made by not just our early ancestors but also Neanderthals. Mm-hmm. Once we get through to the Bronze Age and the Neolithic period, they'd have been using much smaller examples like these, and that again you can see has a fairly steep edge but no cutting edge. You can see that's not cutting me in the slightest, but turned sideways it has a perfect scraping edge. And we also found these really tiny ones, and I believe they've had a few examples like this from this site. Somebody showed me a slightly smaller one earlier on, and again we're talking about a really good scraping edge. You could scrape a deer skin with that in probably no more than half an hour. Very efficient tools, but they were probably still making these well into the Iron Age, because we don't find an Iron Age equivalent for this tool. And the iron being extremely valuable, high status material, would probably have stopped them making items that they could make from stone. The technology was still there.
That's brilliant. What would they use for other applications? Obviously for lighting fires?
Lighting fires, they would have had something similar to this.
Yeah.
With a fairly strong edge that they could strike against a piece of iron. Very carbon rich iron that produces a nice hot spark.
So you have some jewellery there, and I can see there's some
jewellery,
arrowheads as well. Right?
Yeah, well, we'll go with the jewellery, because that's actually one of the only things on the table that we haven't made, and that's we were at the Bushcraft show a few weeks ago, and this was something that was made by the Maasai in Africa, and we actually traded with them some stone tools, which was rather nice, and that's a piece of giraffe bone.
Oh, it's brilliant.
That they've stained up to a nice design.
Tell me about the arrowheads.
We have examples here of the Neolithic types, and that's the straightforward leaf-shaped Neolithic arrowhead, and that's a kind of arrowhead that was possibly used with plant poisons because we don't find any barbs on these arrowheads or the arrow shafts. The earlier arrows would have had a very simple blade point, only take a few seconds to make, but they also had barbs set into the arrow shaft itself, so they were quite vicious hunting points. Once we get to the Bronze Age, they return to a barbed design, and that's the Bronze Age barbed and tanged arrowhead. Very, very vicious points. They don't really start doing their job until they're inside the animal, because the barbs are obviously set to prevent it coming out. If an animal is hit with an arrow, chances are you're not going to kill a big animal with one shot, so it's going to bolt straight for undergrowth. At which point the arrow shaft has been clattered around, so you have a serrated knife cutting inside the animal, left, right and centre. So it creates a much bigger bleed, and that brings the animal down much sooner. We've also got here, actually on a piece of French flint from the Dordogne, it's this nice stripy material, a discoidal knife. Now this one's quite heavily serrated. We don't find them quite that heavily serrated very often because the serrations have been worn down. But that's basically the poor huntsman's tool that would have been kept in a leather pouch, perhaps on the belt. And once they dropped a deer with a bow, they would use this to rip through the meat very, very quickly. So it's essentially a Neolithic or Bronze Age steak knife.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It works incredibly well.
Tell me about that. Oh, go on, carry on.
We've got an example here of a Salutrian spearhead. So this is the kind of thing that would have been made 30 to 40,000 years ago, right the way across Europe, and it was a technology that wasn't really surpassed until the Bronze Age. But this level of skill really died out after the Salutrian culture disappeared or moved along, and they're very, very difficult to make, especially if it's a really long one. Sometimes we find these things a foot long because they have to be incredibly well thinned so they can fit efficiently into a nice thin spear shaft. But we don't see the same level of technology until the appearance of the Bronze Age daggers, which are actually very similar. In fact, if I was to turn this round and make a couple of notches at the base of this, it would pass for a Bronze Age dagger. The technology was very, very similar.
It's amazing, isn't it?
What else have we got? Got a little knife here, again made on the French flint. It's beautiful material, and that's just set into a piece of antler with some pine resin with a little bit of beeswax mixed in to act as a plasticizer so it doesn't crack as it cools down, and that's incredibly strong. So just a simple blade there, again that would have been used for a hunter's knife, just quickly taking an animal apart so they could carry it in pieces back to the camp.
And that's pretty lethal.
It does look pretty vicious, doesn't it? That's a bone harpoon point made from a piece of cow bone. It's entirely made using flint tools. Took about a day to make that. There takes a bit of time and patience, but that's not a type of spear tip that would have been set into the end. Certainly wouldn't have been bound and glued. This was something that was set into a socket on the end of a fairly robust long spear shaft, and the hole was designed to take some cordage, probably several meters of cordage that would then be attached to the spear shaft. So once you'd speared your big flatfish or seal, whatever you were hunting, that would stay inside the animal, it would detach, and then you had basically a fishing rod design that would allow you to tie the animal or the fish out with leverage. So it was quite a clever design.
Well, I'll have to try that. Maybe I'll catch some more fish then.
Yeah, it does work.
Yeah, probably more success.
But that's pretty much everything on the table, with the exception of the Bronze Age axes. And these are quite interesting because we can see in many cases that the flint knappers of the period started to copy the designs of the copper and bronze axes that were appearing, almost as if they were trying to say, well look, ours are just the same shape, they're just as good. But of course you couldn't get such a thin, strong, sharp edge with a piece of flint, so that's one of the reasons that the metalwork started to take over. But they're beautiful, beautiful pieces.
Amazing. Hi Karl, so you're going to sort of show us the process of flint knapping.
Yep.
Right, so what are you going to do to with that piece?
Well, this is a flake I've just taken off a fairly big nodule. So this one was removed using a fairly big quartzite hammerstone. And what I'm going to do is start to shape this down to what we term a rough out, using smaller hammerstones, which are great for removing big pieces of material very, very quickly. But then once it comes to thinning it down, and I'm going to have a go at making an axe head for you, a Bronze Age type axe head. To thin it down, you'll see I switch over to using a piece of deer antler. And the reason the deer antler works incredibly well is it's actually softer than the flint. So when I strike onto the edge, it allows the flint to bite into it. You can see we've got these real pitted surfaces here. That's where it's gripped onto the flint, and this enables me to take off very thin, sharp pieces. So it really is a thinning tool. I've also got an abrading stone to grind off the really thin, sharp edges, the very delicate edges, to make them much stronger. So I'm going to start off just using a fairly small hammerstone. It's not a huge piece of flint. And start to flake it down.
Yeah, so I'll just go this way.
And one of the most amazing things about flint knapping, and does surprise lots of people, is that it's entirely about the use of angles. And when you consider that our ancestors started to do this on a fairly artistic level about 2.5 million years ago, it really does make you think our knuckle-dragging ape ancestors obviously weren't as stupid as they're currently made out to be, because they had a working knowledge of angles and symmetry. Lots of the tools we find right the way across Africa are a lovely teardrop shape, so they were obviously working towards making symmetrical tools.
I would know what I be putting on television. That's cool.
So I'm just preparing the edges really for the antler hammer. I'm grinding them back, making them as strong as possible so I can give them a fairly good thump. There we go, so I've worked right the way around the outside edge of the blank, and now I can switch over to the antler hammer. And you can see the pieces that come off are very, very thin, very sharp. And in fact, in the Bronze Age, they wouldn't have discarded that, because that is a perfect blank for the barbed and tanged arrowheads that they were making. So I'm going to put that one to one side. Now I'm not trying to thin this down too much, because obviously if it's an axe head it's going to need a bit of thickness to it for strength. So you can see it's starting to look like an axe head already, but in the Bronze Age they were making some fairly peculiar shapes. And what I'm going to go for with this one is what we term a wasted axe head. So it kind of tapers in towards the centre and then splays back out again. So I need to regrind the edges. And what I'm going to be trying to do is take off some of these high spots. So I need to prepare the edges in a very specific way that will allow me to send shock waves to flake across the surface to undermine those high spots. And once the edges are nice and strong, I can give them a good confident thump to start thinning it down. And you can see I've struck the edge just here. The energy has crept up and picked up this high ridge and it's followed it as far as it possibly could. And that's how we can start to steer the flakes to make just the shape that we're looking for. Now I've just picked up a crack in the flint, so I'm going to have to be fairly careful just for a few minutes to make sure I don't aggravate that and crack it any further across. So I need to just tone down how hard I'm going to be hitting the edge in that section. So now I can have a go undermining that crack just to get rid of it. There we go. And then the pressure's off a little bit. So I'm quite happy with this side, it's fairly flat, but on the other side I've still got this fairly high ridge, so I need to set up some new angles along this side to send some flakes over and try and undermine that. Really toughening up that edge again, so I can confidently strike it with quite a lot of force to get those flakes to travel. There we go, and you can see that one just taken off most of that ridge. And I'm left with a single ridge now running across the body, which is just what we're looking for. And I can use that to try and send one flake straight over. There it is. And we think the reason that they started to make these fairly strange wasted axe heads was that they were still trying to compete in the Bronze Age with the new axes that would be made out of copper and bronze. almost as if they were still saying, look, we can do it too. So I'm really working on the symmetry now. It's a little bit scruffy here. I'll try and tidy up the surface. It might seem a little bit silly thinking about kind of cosmetics on this, but this particular type of axe head, which is quite common throughout Yorkshire, we think was never used. They seem to have been a status item because they're quite difficult to make, and we very rarely find any with uses of wear on them. Sometimes they were quite heavily polished, which again is a suggestion that they were never really designed for use. Because if I was to take this away and completely polish it, it would take probably the best part of a week. And that's pure elbow grease, grinding it against a piece of sandstone. And you can tell when I get to a stressful part because I suddenly go very quiet. It's almost there. I've got to be quite careful here, because once you've made something longer than it is wide, it becomes susceptible to something called end shock, and that's kind of a double shockwave effect that can break the whole thing straight across the centre. So when it comes to striking the ends now, I have to be incredibly careful. I'm quite happy with the shape, so now I need to put on the cutting edge, and I'm going to do that very gently because I don't want to produce end shock. the last ugly flake to come off. Because half of the skill is knowing when to stop. I think I'm going to stop about there.
Hiya, Karl. So what was that like? So they looked quite specific in what you were doing.
Yeah, it does take a lot of practice, obviously, developing the hand-eye coordination. You probably noticed I was using quite a big hammer there to take off pieces that are not really much more than 1 millimetre wide. It does take practice like any other skill. But you may also have noticed that between some of the blows, clearly there wasn't really time for me to think about what I was doing. I'm just recognising the angles and off comes a piece of flint. And the only thing really I can liken that to is changing gear in a car. You get to a certain level of experience driving where your brain will read the sound of the engine and you change gear. You don't think about it, you just do it. And it's very similar to that really. I think there's lots of skills that require that level of, or perhaps that part of the brain to take over and do it for you.
It's quite precise, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's quite a precise craft, you know.
Definitely, but again, I mean, really all we're doing is complementing the skills that our ancestors developed thousands of years ago.
So that would, you know, from beginning to end, I mean final end, the final polishing and, you know, complete satisfaction.
Yeah.
How long would that have taken normally?
With a piece, I mean, that one smoothed down fairly nicely. There aren't any kind of high ridges or peaks on it.
Yeah.
So to polish something like that completely would probably take 3 days, and that's all day non-stop grinding on a piece of sandstone.
Yeah.
So they were prized items. I mean, to be powerful enough to have somebody go and polish that axe for you and spend that amount of time, by the time it came to you, you would appreciate that value. It would have been a very important piece of stoneworking.
You said that piece made, you know, something that size, it was like a ceremonial thing rather than a practical.
Not necessarily ceremonial, but certainly it was a high status piece. It would have been something to show off.
Sorry, wrong wording. Yeah. So would they have been buried with that sort of thing?
Yeah, in fact, the type I just made, the wasted axe head, is very commonly found in Yorkshire. Well, not commonly found, but we find more of them in Yorkshire than anywhere else. And as far as I'm aware, almost entirely they've come out of burials. They've come out of barrows. So yeah, I mean, they were so important. You'd want that to go to the afterlife with you.
Well, thanks very much for that, Karl.
You're welcome. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers.